This recording is going to cover the nervous system. The nervous system is the most highly organized system in the body. It is the body's control center, and it allows us to interpret what is occurring to our external environment and helps us decide how to react. The nervous system is divided into two main classifications, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, abbreviated as CNS, is a control center for the entire nervous system. It is the main network of coordination and control for the entire body. It consists of the brain, or encephalon, and the spinal cord, which are protected and encased in bone. The brain and the spinal cord are continuous with each other at the foramen magnum. The function of the central nervous system is to evaluate incoming information and formulate a response to them. It integrates various impulses as well as thinking. The peripheral nervous system, abbreviated PNS, is the second subdivision of the nervous system, and it consists of all nervous tissue outside the central nervous system, meaning the cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Its function is to connect the central nervous system with the remaining parts of the body. The brain, or encephalon. For our purposes, we'll subdivide the brain, or encephalon, into three parts. The cerebrum, Latin for brain, is the largest part of the brain. It is the area for reasoning and intellect. It provides us with the ability to read, write, speak, make calculation, and compose music. Remember the past and make plans for the future. It is divided into two hemispheres, a right and a left, that are connected to each other by the corpus callosum. It functions in intelligence, motor function, personality, reasoning, touch sensation, and interpretation of sensory impulses. There are 4 lobes in each hemisphere of the cerebrum, and they're named after the bones that cover them. So let's take a look at the lobes and what each is responsible for. The frontal lobe is responsible for volunteer motor function, motivation, aggression, mood, speech, and thought processes. The parietal lobe is responsible for processing information about touch reception and evaluation of sensory information. The occipital lobe receives and processes visual information, and the temporal lobe receives auditory signals. The cerebellum, Latin for little brain, is the second largest part of the brain, and it occupies the inferior and posterior aspect of the cranial cavity. It has 2 hemispheres. It is smaller than the cerebrum, but it does contain more neurons or nerve cells. It functions in skilled movements anywhere from catching a ball to dancing, posture and balance, and coordination. The brain stem. This is the smallest portion of the brain and is situated between the spinal cord and the cerebrum. It consists of 3 portions. The medulla oblongata, this is the most inferior part of the brain stem, is continuous with the superior portion of the spinal cord, and it controls heart rate, respiration, digestion, and the constriction of blood vessels. The pons is the middle portion of the brain stem, and this is located directly superior to the medulla. Its function is to relay nerve impulses related to voluntary skeletal movements and helps control breathing. The midbrain is the smallest and uppermost part of the brainstem. It is located superior to the pons. Its function is to convey motor impulses. It is the reflex center that controls movement of the eyeballs. In response to visual stimulation, it controls the movement of the head and the trunk, and it is response to the auditory stimuli such as loud noises. The coverings of the brain and spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord are very delicate and vital to our existence, and therefore they have 2 protective mechanisms. The outer protective covering is bone, and the 3 inner protective coverings are called meninges. So let's take a look at the meninges. The pia mater. Pia means delicate. It is the deep, inner, thin, transparent connective tissue layer, and it adheres to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. It's very rich in blood vessels. Arachnoid. Arachne means spider. The middle layer of the meninges, it is composed of a delicate collagen fibers and some elastic tissues. It's called the arachnoid because of its spiderweb arrangement. The dura mater. Dura means tough and mater is mother, so I guess it's a tough mother. This is the outermost superficial layer, and it's composed of strong, dense, irregular connective tissue. There are spaces between and around the meninges. The epidural space, this is located outside of the dura mater but inside of the bone, and this contains a cushion of fat. The subdural space is located between the dura mater and the arachnoid. This contains a small amount of lubricating fluid. The subarachnoid space is located under the arachnoid. It's between the arachnoid and the pia mater, and this contains a significant amount of cerebral spinal fluid. The ventricular system and cerebral spinal fluid of the brain. The ventricles of the brain. Ventricles are fluid-filled cavities within the brain through which cerebral spinal fluid will flow. The names of these ventricles are the right and left lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricles. We have foramens in the brain. The ventricles connect to each other by various openings called foramens. The interventricular foramen is also known as the foramen of Monro, and it's the passageway between the lateral and the third ventricle. Cerebral aqueduct, or aqueduct of Sylvius, is a narrow slit between the third and the fourth ventricle. Foramen of Meninges, or the median foramen, is the opening between the lower part of the roof in the fourth ventricle and the subarachnoid space. The lateral foramen is also known as the foramen of Lischka. These are two openings between the ends of each lateral recess of the fourth ventricle and the subarachnoid space. Cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. This is a clear, colorless fluid that bathes the entire surface of the central nervous system. It is produced in specialized cells within each ventricle called the choroid plexus. It nourishes and protects against chemical or physical injury. It acts to cushion a blow to the head to lessen the impact. It protects the brain from damage. It continuously circulates through the subarachnoid space and around the brain and spinal cord and through the ventricles. Cerebral spinal fluid will be reabsorbed through ovoid structures in the superior sagittal sinus known as arachnoid villi. The pathway of cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is formed with the choroid plexus of the right and left lateral ventricles and then flows into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen or foramen of Monro. Fluid will then flow from the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius into the fourth ventricle. Cerebral spinal fluid will flow through two lateral apertures and one median aperture into the subarachnoid space. It will then go down the posterior aspect of the brain and spinal cord, and then it will flow up the anterior aspect of the spinal cord and the brain, and then is reabsorbed. You should take a look at the diagram under the pathway of cerebral spinal fluid to help you visualize this. The spinal cord. This is located in the spinal cavity of the vertebral column. It is shorter than the vertebral column. It is approximately 16 to 18 inches in length. It extends from the foramen magnum to the second lumbar vertebrae, which is abbreviated L2. All the nerves to the trunk and extremities emerge from the spinal cord. The spinal cord is described as being a cylindrical structure flattened in its anterior and posterior dimensions, and it has two bulges or enlargements. The cervical enlargement is the superior enlargement, and it extends from the fourth cervical vertebrae to the first thoracic, so that's from C4 to T1. The brachial plexus, which are nerves, that supply the upper extremities, will arise or come out from here. The lumbar enlargement is the inferior enlargement, and this extends from T9 to T12. The nerves that supply the lower extremities arise from here. The conus medullaris. This is the tapered or conical portion of the spinal cord. It is located inferior to the lumbar enlargement, and it is considered to be the terminal end or portion of the spinal cord. The chorda equina. This is a tail-like collection of roots of spinal nerves. It is located at the inferior end of the spinal cord, and these are actually the roots of the sacral and coccygeal nerves. It gets its name because it resembles a horse's tail. The filum terminale is the non-nervous, elastic, fibrous tissue of the spinal cord. It extends inferiorly from the conus medullaris to the coccyx. It serves to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx.